Welcome to the Global Missions Podcast, a show for Christ followers who want to participate more effectively in God's work both at home and to the ends of the earth. Visit us at globalmissionspodcast.com to find show notes, resources, and previous episodes. You can also engage with us through Twitter and Facebook. We would love to hear from you. And now, here's your host, Rob Magwood, better known to many friends as Mags.
Well, good day, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Global Missions Podcast. Our topic today is developing our biblical understanding of poverty, and we're going to seek to maintain a unified view of good news with good works. Our guest is Barry Slauenwhite, who is a fellow Canadian and serves as the president and CEO of Compassion Canada. Compassion, of course, is a leading child development ministry with over 7,000 local church partners across 25 countries. Barry is a passionate guy, especially about promoting holistic child development through the local church. He is an author as well of two books. The first is A Journey of Compassion, and the second is soon to be released, Strategic Compassion, Reuniting the Good News and Good Works in the Fight Against Poverty. Barry, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
Just before we get into our main topic about a biblical view of poverty and releasing people from that poverty, tell us a bit about Compassion Canada and about your role there, please.
Well, Compassion's ministry really encompasses a global perspective in reaching those who live in extreme or abject poverty around the world, with the unique script of addressing especially children. We found and have found that children are the most vulnerable, and our passion is to reach the youngest possible and begin a journey with them through not only child or personal development, but spiritual development.
And the Lord brought you to Compassion Canada now, it's just a few years ago, we'll say, right?
Yeah, it was just shortly after the Ark landed. I'm celebrating 35 years this year.
Wow. Well done. Well done. And your role there at present is?
I am currently the president and CEO, and I'll be in this role for about another year and a half, and then I'll be stepping out into a different role.
And there's some very exciting plans there, too. Why don't you introduce us to that sharp gal that is working together with you?
Absolutely. Well, back in 2009, I presented our board with a paper and basically alerted them that October 2019, that's 10 years from then, I plan to step out. I plan to retire. The board just recently announced my successor, one of our current staff, one of my colleagues. Her name is Alison Ali. She's been working with Compassion for 5 years now, leading one of our major initiatives. And I am absolutely convinced that she is the right person to take this role, and I am so excited. I really didn't think I'd be this happy at this point, but I really am.
Oh, I'm glad. And it's great to hear of a healthy succession taking place.
Amen.
Well, today Barry's going to help us explore what the Bible teaches us about poverty. He's got some practical advice and some ideas here. Barry, let's start with a foundational question. What does the Bible say about poverty?
I think the Bible is very clear about poverty, but here's the problem. Over time, over centuries, we as the church, we as the Christian community, we as the community at large have struggled to really understand what I might call the theology of poverty. So really, what does the Bible say about poverty? My experience in meeting people across Canada and throughout North America especially is that most of what we know about poverty doesn't come from the Bible. It comes from marketing messages, from TV commercials, from advertisements. And if you look at them, they have one common thread. Another car wash will end poverty. Raise all the money you can. But if you look at Scripture, it's not about money. It's about something much, much deeper. And to understand it, you have to go all the way back to the book of Genesis.
Back in the book of Genesis, we're back to creation. And God, when he created the world originally, the Bible teaches us that it was very good, right? That's where we're beginning.
It was, yeah. It's this perfect world where Adam and Eve, the only inhabitants at that point, had no concept of need. The word poverty never existed. It wasn't in their vocabulary. They didn't want for anything because everything they needed, God provided for them. It was this perfect world that we all dream of living in someday. Mm-hmm. But here's the problem. Early in their journey in this perfect world, they listened to a voice. That voice was Satan. And that voice said, you remember that tree that God said don't eat from? You know what? Really, he was exaggerating. That tree is probably the best tree, the best fruit you've ever had. Why don't you go ahead and take it? And when Adam and Eve ate that forbidden fruit, something terrible happened. We call this a cause and effect. So we teach our children, you do this, that'll happen. Touch the hot stove, you'll get burned. Mm-hmm. Go too fast on your bicycle, you'll fall off. And God already established there is an effect if you break my rule. And so in this world where poverty could not exist, there was no thought of it. From that point on, poverty became the default setting of the entire world. And even fast forward to today, every human being born is born in a world of poverty. Mm.
So this is something that's not affecting just those in, I'll say, lower GDP countries. It's affecting all of us.
It is, whether it's things like food shortages, mm-hmm. things like economic collapse, mm-hmm. all of these things, droughts and earthquakes, poor crop yields, war and corruption, all of these symptoms are a result of poverty. Because poverty is not just a lack of something. Poverty, as we see from understanding the Genesis account, is actually a spiritual condition. It's a condition of not trusting God, of not knowing that God is our provider. Mm. And we then, as human beings, we reach out to replace what we think God is deficient in.
So we have here a bit of a summary then. We have a sense of what poverty is. It's a spiritual condition. It's not just economic, you've said. We have a sense of the breadth of it. Mm-hmm. It affects all of us. According to the Bible, then, what is the cure for poverty?
Well, here's the thing. If poverty is a spiritual condition, then the cure or the answer must also be spiritual. And that's where, again, we turn to the scripture. And that's where we go to Luke chapter 4, where Jesus went back to his hometown of Nazareth. And this is a familiar story to Bible readers. He went into the synagogue and they passed him the scroll of Isaiah. And he opened it to a certain spot and he read, and he said to the crowd that day, I have come to bring good news to the poor. And as you read on and as you unpack scripture, you find that that good news was not economic reform. It was not global handouts or any kind of humanitarian efforts. That good news, as Jesus himself later says, is the good news of the gospel. Mm-hmm. The gospel is what changes people. In my book, I actually take you through that to make a pretty solid case that any and all other attempts to alleviate poverty have failed in spite of the billion and trillion dollar budgets that we have assigned to these efforts.
Mm-hmm. Well, that is a helpful starting point to say that it's a spiritual problem and a spiritual solution. For decades, the church has wrestled with this, Barry. How do we tackle poverty? We see many ministries trying to deal with poverty in different ways. I like where you're going with this because it seems some are really focused on a physical solution. They say we need to alleviate poverty. That means something economic. Others are saying we need to focus on evangelism. We need to keep the gospel central. But you're bringing these two things together.
Exactly. And where I get this genius of an idea is not in a dream I had or a book I read. This ingenious idea comes from Jesus Christ himself. If you study his life in the short time he was here on earth, he brought and he married these two concepts together. These very same concepts that we have disengaged from each other. We have dichotomized. So we basically have said you do one or the other. You specialize in humanitarian aid or you specialize in the gospel. Mm-hmm. Jesus never, ever separated them. Jesus had the largest feeding program in the known world. I mean, nobody ever in history fed that many people with a little snack pack.
Right.
Jesus was one of the greatest educators of the world. People walked in bare feet for days to hear him give a lecture. Jesus was the greatest and most renowned medical doctor or healer. He did all of these things, but he himself said, that's not the reason I came. I didn't come from heaven to earth to do these good things. So then it begs the question, well, why do you do them? Why don't you just preach? And Jesus helps us to understand that you do these good things because you love the people you're preaching to. So in other words, we take from that, we say the priority must be the gospel because that's what saves us, that's what changes us. But the gospel is not a standalone product. The gospel must be wrapped in our good deeds, in our good works, in our acts of love and kindness. So we have been wrong for centuries in separating these. We must bring them together, and we must do both. So the challenge for the church, the challenge for the missions committee, for the individual Christ follower is, how do I invest either my finances or my time or my skills in a holistic approach to ending poverty? Because most Christians, sadly, are spending too much of their money funding humanitarian efforts that haven't got even a trace of the gospel.
Well, overall, what I hear you're saying, it's not either or. It's not helping with physical poverty or the gospel. It's both and we need to wrestle with what that unity, not a dichotomy, looks like.
Absolutely. You nailed it right on.
Well, I know you've seen a lot of the world, Barry, traveled to many, many countries, many situations. Would you share with us an example of when you have seen this holistic approach to addressing poverty being cured, that holistic approach really working well?
I have seen it at many levels in my 35 years of working abroad. I've seen it at the broad scale community level. I've seen where people within a very impoverished community find Christ. That hope generates excitement, enthusiasm, ingenuity, productivity, and they change their surroundings. I've also seen it more often in individuals. Let me tell you one case in point. I have a friend of mine. Her name is Jackie, and Jackie was one of our sponsored children in Uganda. She grew up in a small village where her and her family were the poorest inhabitants of the village. Even the poor people made fun of them, how they dressed and how they lived. Her father abandoned the family when she was very young. She was left as the oldest child with two siblings, trying to figure out a way that she could help supplement her family's income, help her poor, destitute mother. And the only option she was aware of as a little girl, 6, 7 years old, was, as some girls in the village had done, gone to the capital city, Kampala, and worked on the streets and send money back to their families. So she began to think about that future. And she determined that she was too young at 6 or 7. She'd have to probably be about 12 before she could make that journey and do that work. The first thing I want to ask is, who put that thought in her mind? Right. So we go back to our cause of poverty. Mm-hmm. Who lies to these children like Jackie and says that's the only option you have? So let's establish that first, that thought, that lie comes from Satan. Yeah. Secondly, about a year after this thought began to live in her mind, in her heart, Compassion and the local church in her community formed a partnership, and we opened the Child Development Center in the church. Hers being the poorest family, her and her siblings were the first ones enrolled. So let's fast forward for the sake of time. She went to Kampala some years later, after she graduated from high school. She went to Kampala, not to work on the streets, but to go to law school. And today, she is a prominent human rights lawyer specializing in children's rights. But even that is not the most exciting thing. In that journey as a sponsored child, she met Jesus Christ. And Jesus Christ completely revolutionized her life and her destiny. And it was in that act of accepting Christ that she took her first step out of poverty. And during the 5 years she was in university, she joined a compassion cohort of 50 of our sponsored students who were in university. During that 5 years, her and her cohort study team was responsible for planting 3 churches, building several dozen homes for the poor, and leading over 900 people to Christ.
Wow.
By the age of 26.
It's beautiful.
You see, that's proof of my point. She was the recipient of many handouts in her village. Aid groups came in and did all kinds of giveaways, but none of it made an impact like the gospel did. When she accepted Christ, she took her first step out of poverty and she never looked back.
Oh, beautiful story with beautiful fruit that is multiplied. In a moment, Barry is going to share some advice for missions committees that might be listening and churches and church members about how you can integrate this biblical understanding of poverty into your mission strategy. Just before we get to those questions, we'd like to share with you a resource that may be helpful to you and your church.
Ignite your passion for the world. The Jaffrey Center is made up of people like you and me who want to engage the world around them in new and meaningful ways. Through collaborative project development, training, and research projects, the Jaffrey Center seeks to rekindle and ignite a passion for God's unending concern for people. To learn more about us, visit www.jaffreyglobal.com. And now, back to today's conversation.
We're back with Barry Slauenwhite, who has just presented us with a quick overview of what the Bible says about poverty. It's a spiritual problem that affects us all. Barry, some of our listeners may have never thought of addressing poverty in the way you've described it today. What advice do you have for a pastor or for someone on a missions committee who wants to integrate this more adequately into their church missions program?
Oh, that's a beautiful open-ended question. Let me rehearse. Let me restate this, that if we're serious about poverty, we must not separate poverty from the gospel. That is fundamental. For any church, for any family, we must understand that. And therefore, that then drives or informs our decision-making, how we as a family, how we as a church, a missions committee, how we then carry out the Great Commission. No other single strategy has more power to change people than the gospel.
Amen.
What I have found as a pastor myself, so I'm guilty of this first, and in my many, many dialogues with pastors across North America, I have found that there are 3 words that are often missing from our missional strategies. And I think close attention to these three words will absolutely revolutionize the way a church missions committee approaches their missions program. The first word is focus. We often can look at the way churches in North America do missions, and we can kind of use the analogy of a shotgun approach. You know, a shotgun, it shoots out these little pellets and they go all directions.
Right.
And we hope to hit something here and there. But if you're a really poor shot and you want to hit a target, use a shotgun. You're bound to get one pellet at least into your target. And we've done that. So we've sent $20 here a month. We support this, and we send a team there, and we're constantly changing because we're not getting return on investment that we had hoped, and we're looking for the silver bullet. So I challenge missions committees. I challenge churches, families, individuals, focus. Find something, somewhere where God is exciting your heart. Maybe it's a country. Maybe it's a region within a country. Maybe it's a type of ministry like a ministry to mothers or a ministry to children or whatever. So find something you can grab onto and focus. The second word is strategy. Many times in our missional thinking, we don't think through well. We have maybe a 6-month or a 1-year plan. We might know where we're sending the next mission team, but we don't have a long-term strategy. What do we want to accomplish? How will we get there? The third word is accountability. So as a missions committee, as a church leader, as a family, how do you know the resources you are investing are actually impacting the kingdom in the way you had hoped or thought they would? So build in, look for, insist upon accountability structures that you can actually touch or actually determine an ROI. So focus, strategy, accountability. And in all of your missional plans and efforts, insist that the gospel is never absent. It's okay to do great, wonderful things, but the gospel must be front and center, or else you are just guilty of being another humanitarian organization, maybe with a Christian name.
Well, 3 very strong words. It could be helpful. Focus, strategy, accountability, and an unrelenting commitment to make sure that the gospel message is clear. It's a strategy in a nutshell there, Barry. I wonder if you could provide us with an example of a church where you've seen this, the focus, the strategy, and the accountability with the commitment to the gospel.
I've seen actually quite a few in an exciting way. I spend a lot of my time working with churches, and I have a whole team across Canada that works with churches. So we try to identify what their passion is, and then we try to help encourage them. And so I just recently worked with a church who self-admitted that their mission program was best described by the shotgun analogy. And they were actually so discouraged that they were actually thinking of reining in their missions giving because they could not identify the impact that they were having for the tens of thousands of dollars they were investing and the mission trips and all of that. So they regrouped. I took the pastor and a couple leaders with me to a particular country where we work, and I just exposed them to the church there. What the church in that country is doing and how effective a holistic approach to poverty is, using, again, Jesus' example. So they retooled. They went about the focus concept. That was their first move. And then they built a strategy. So they reined in all of their shotgun giving around the world. They reined it into a specific country, a specific target demographic group with the local church there, building relationships, establish accountability structures where they go physically every year and see for themselves what impact their investments are having. And that church has tripled their missional giving, tripled. And the pastor couldn't be more excited to talk about missions today. Whereas just a few years ago, it was something they were actually thinking of withdrawing from. There are many of those kinds of examples across our beautiful country.
That's great. Well, we're thankful that this provides a little bit of a blueprint for our listeners to think about. Barry, we've just scratched on the surface of a very important topic. What resources do you have that you would recommend to our listeners who want to learn more about this and facing poverty in a healthy way?
Well, if you go on our Compassion's website, compassion.ca, you'll see there are several resources, rather new ones that we've created. One of the ones that I would strongly suggest is Step Into My Shoes. So it takes families, it takes small groups on a journey. Eyes to See is another one. These ones are excellent resources. And then we mentioned earlier my new book coming out. It just actually came off the printer a couple of days ago, and it's going to be available in a few weeks, called Strategic Compassion. And basically what I do is I do a study on the theology of poverty. And I take the readers through the Bible to help them, as we talked earlier today, help them understand what the biblical approach to poverty needs to be. And that book will be available at Amazon.com. It'll also be available on a website that will be going live in a couple of weeks, strategiccompassionbook.com.
We will include all of this, as our listeners know, regular listeners will know, we will include all of this in our show notes, realizing there's a slight delay of a couple of weeks before this last book that Barry's mentioned. Tell us the title again.
Strategic Compassion, Reuniting the Good News and Good Works in the Fight Against Poverty.
Super. Barry, if any of our listeners would like to reach out and continue a conversation with you, how could they best do that?
I'm happy to have those conversations. In fact, they enrich me. And probably the easiest way, because I travel so much, is through email. Mm-hmm. So my email address is very simple. B for Barry, last name Slauenwhite. So B Slauenwhite at compassion.ca.
Very good. And we will also include Barry's email in the show notes, just so you get the spelling correct, and he would be glad to hear from you. Barry, just want to say a big thank you for your faithful service. 35 years, bringing an organization from being relatively smaller to impacting tens of thousands of kids in these days. Thank you for your faithful service and for taking the time to join with us today.
Always a pleasure. Thank you.
Well, that concludes today's episode. We are so glad that Barry could join us today. Many of us, of course, know of compassion through child sponsorship, and that may be something that you would like to consider. You can visit their website, compassion.ca, or for our friends in the United States, compassion.com. It's a wonderful ministry that is changing many, many lives. Now, for the podcast, we have just a couple of episodes remaining in this third season. Next up is Ed Vencio, who is the project manager for an exciting new resource for short-term missions called the Go Journal. We'll also talk with Ken Hall, who's an expert in insurance, and he will help us know how to adequately protect and cover our short-term mission teams. And finally, in our last episode, we're going to have a guest host on this program who will turn the tables and interview me. That's going to be a very interesting conversation, a little bit of behind the scenes on how we do this podcast. Remember, you can find any titles or websites or email addresses that Barry mentioned in today's episode in the show notes at globalmissionspodcast.com. We also want you to watch for his new book, Strategic Compassion, Reuniting the Good News and Good Works in the Fight Against Poverty. That's it for today. The Global Missions Podcast is produced by the Jaffrey Center for Global Initiatives and Send International of Canada in collaboration with other like-minded agencies. On behalf of the entire team, thanks for listening today, and we invite you to join us again in 2 weeks when we'll continue to explore the grand adventure of being Christ's witnesses to the ends of the earth.